And there we go. I want to welcome everyone to this conference in honor of that virtuous and benevolent being, Robert Faulkner. I want to remind you to begin with that you should mute yourself. I think everyone is muted. The way the conference will run is that we have 3 sessions, 2 today and 1 tomorrow. Today we're featuring Bob's career as an educator of graduate students. And tomorrow we'll have a panel discussion in which we feature his scholarship and people who've been influenced by it, his colleagues, and even a former undergraduate student, now a colleague, speaking. I'll give a very brief introduction to Bob's career, which I think most of you are probably familiar with. And what I'm going to do is talk today a little bit about his career as one of the leading lights of the graduate program at Boston College. And I'm going to give some data that I found that is truly astonishing to indicate what a leading light he has been. Bob arrived at Boston College in 1968. And it was around that time that he and others, David Lowenthal, who I saw is here, started a PhD program. Since then, Bob has been on the dissertation committee of over 30% of the students who have finished the PhD at Boston College. This is not 30% of the people who finished the PhD in political theory, his subfield. He has been on the committee of 30% of the people who finished the PhD program simply. You know, Boston College has a new math PhD program. So there probably are a few members of the math department who have been on 100% of the 2 committees in which people have gotten PhDs. That won't be true 50 years from now. It would be very difficult to find someone who could match that record in any program anywhere over such a sustained period of time. The numbers fell just short of a third. I would have liked to have said a third, but it was over 30% of the students. I also looked into the question of Bob's fundraising for fellowships for graduate students, something he did not entirely alone, but with other people, Susan Schell, Chris Bruhl, David Lowenthal, but Bob really took a lead in the funding. And what I realized looking at the total amount of money is that he and they funded the total education of 15% of the graduate students who have gotten a PhD at Boston College. So in other words, the program is that much larger because of those fundraising efforts. In some other departments, that might not seem a really strange thing. You know, biology professors have to raise funds for their labs, and their labs pay for their graduate assistants. However, biology professors raise funds for their own labs, and there are extra benefits that go to the department as a whole from that. The funding that Bob raised was not just so that he could have teaching and research assistants. There have probably been only a few members of the department who have not had a teaching or research assistant because of Bob's efforts. You know, with a small program and a medium number of faculties, there's always a shortage of assistants. That extra 15% has made a great difference to the daily life of virtually every member of the department. So that's an indication of the quantitative contribution of Bob to the graduate department. Today's 2 panels give us some indication of the qualitative contribution in terms of the work of his students. And I want to say that in discussing this with Bob, who should be invited, what sort of presentation should be given, the clear emphasis was to allow the former students, sometimes recent former students, sometimes not so recent former students, to present their research with some connection to the education they got from Bob. It's not their comments on Bob's research as much as it is their presentation of their independent research, which I think has always been a hallmark of Bob as a teacher. He's very good at promoting other people to do their own work. So our speakers today will be, first of all, Allison Levy, a tutor from St. John's College in Santa Fe. At Boston College, there is a custom to refer to certain sorts of alumni as triple eagles. That means generally someone who went to Boston College High School, Boston College as an undergraduate, and Boston College Law School. But there are other forms of triple eagles. Allison is someone who went to Boston College as an undergraduate, the Boston College Master's Program, and the Boston College PhD program. And I think that's as good a triple eagle as any of the other ones. So Allison's paper will be on Thucydides' Civil War Psychology. Our second speaker will be Peter McNamara, who's from the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Peter has previously taught at Utah State and other places. He is a scholar of Enlightenment thought and American political thought, particularly on Alexander Hamilton, and his paper today will be on Alexander Hamilton on War and Peace. The discussant for the panels will be one of our current graduate students, a fourth-year graduate student in political theory, Adam Sliwowski. The format will be each of the speakers will speak for about 20 minutes. Adam will speak for about 15 minutes. I'll give the speakers a chance to respond. With the number of people we have, we can't really work very well calling for questions from the audience. So what I'll ask you to do is to use the chat function. And at any point you want to type in the question you would like to ask. And then when we get to the general discussion period, I'll relay that. So I want to conclude this by issuing a few thanks. I want to thank all of you for coming. As is always the case with any event sponsored by the Political Science Department at Boston College, I want to thank Shirley G. for all the help she gave me in writing the grant proposal that made this possible. And since then, I also want to thank the staff of the Center on Centers and the Institute for the Liberal Arts at Boston College, who both funded this and provided all the technical assistance that has made it possible. And they've been immensely helpful. I could have set up a Zoom meeting, but allowing for registration and things like that would have been far beyond me. Again, mute yourself if you're not muted, and I'll turn things over to Allison.
Okay, thank you, Chris, for having me and for putting all this together. It's a pleasure and an honor to get to say something on such a lovely occasion. Not aware of any career more worthy of celebration than this one. And Professor Faulkner is, in my experience, a little bit of a difficult man to praise. He's too high-minded to put up with much of it, so it's nice that he's stuck with it from us for a few days. In thinking about Professor Faulkner's influence on my work, I was mostly struck that I have too many things to thank him for. As Chris said, I was an undergrad and a grad student at BC. Professor Faulkner taught the first strictly political philosophy course that I took, which was on Machiavelli and Hobbes. And I remember clearly in the first class thinking, what is this delight of a human being? So full of life and good humor, together with this profound insightfulness and seriousness. He was digging things out of the old books that I would never have seen or thought to look for there, and that were of manifest importance to human life. What do Machiavelli and Hobbes say humans are about? What do they want? And what should they want or aim at? What's the cost of going their way? I thought, wow, I wasn't yet a political science major at this point, and apart from the terrific Alice Benegar, who recommended Faulkner's class to me, my experience of college to that point had been of pettier things, or things that struck me as pretentious, merely academic, rather disconnected from the real stuff of life. Professor Faulkner gave me an education that far surpassed anything I thought to hope for when I went to college. He did as much as anyone to show me that one could think seriously about one's life, to show the importance and the pleasure of getting as clear as possible about the situation we're in and what's best in life, and to provide a truly excellent example of such thoughtfulness. Then in graduate school, which I probably wouldn't have attended but for him, he introduced me to Thucydides' work, which I wrote my dissertation on and which I'm working on again. It's what my paper's on today, as Chris said. I think studying with Professor Faulkner in graduate school, I came to appreciate more, and since then still more, that he has a mix of qualities that one almost never sees united in one person. As is clear to everyone, he's got this wonderful generosity, high-mindedness, as well as compassion and gentleness with the needier souls like myself. I truly don't think I've seen a sign of anything low in the man. And being a person of such quality, it's unsurprising that he has very great access to and appreciation for what's highest in human beings generally, which he brings out for others from great books, in his classes and in conversation, with evident pleasure, sensitivity, and depth. But what's even more extraordinary than that, I think, is that he's also very tough-minded and sober about the limits of those high things and the critiques that they're susceptible to from various points of view. In his case, that profound understanding exists alongside continued terrific fineness of character and appreciation for what is high in human nature, which is not only a beautiful way for a person to be, it's also one of the things that makes his thought extremely valuable, because he avoids cynicism and reductivism, and thereby distortion in describing and grasping these crucial phenomena. As to following the example of his work, it's tough thing to do. Who knows how much luck I've had. And as to his character, the example of that, forget it. But I'm extremely grateful for the model, as I am for the very many other kindnesses he's done me. It's been a tremendous blessing in my life to have gotten to know and learn from him. So thank you, Professor Faulkner. Congratulations. To turn to my paper, From the Fine and the Noble to the Worst of Human Nature, I wrote on Thucydides' account of civil war. Though it is my hope that understanding what went wrong in the Civil War sheds some light on the character of the higher things. In describing the horrors that first beset the city of Corcyra and then spread to most cities in Greece, Thucydides presents a graphic portrait of politics at its most dysfunctional. Fathers killed sons, men were dragged from temples and killed near them, or in some cases inside them, and in Corcyra, the violence didn't cease until one of the two parties to the conflict was effectively wiped out. But how precisely do they come to the point at which, quote, every form of death came to be, a misery surely desired by no one? Thucydides stresses that civil war and its calamities will remain permanent features of political life. Such things as happened, quote, will always happen, as long as the nature of human beings remains the same. This indicates that civil war and its pathologies are possibilities latent in politics as ordinarily experienced. In an attempt to come to a better understanding, then, of what happened during the civil wars, my paper considered Thucydides' famous comments about the changes undergone by language and morals at that time, together with his suggestions about morals in healthier political circumstances. In this way, it sought to shed light on the delicate balances that obtain in healthier political life, and to clarify the most important psychological forces at work during the civil wars. As to the changes that civil war occasioned in language and morals, Thucydides says this, quote, the customary meaning of names and their relation to deeds changed as men thought right. Thoughtless daring came to be held to be the courage or manliness of a loyal comrade, cautious forethought a pretext for cowardice, moderation a cloak of unmanliness, and to be intelligent in everything was to be inactive in all. Rash quickness was agreed to be a man's part, and caution and deliberation a good-sounding pretext for shirking, end quote. Thus, men still used words like courage and moderation, but the words signified something different than they had before. Still, their new meanings were not altogether different from their old ones. My paper suggested that the changes in what was praised and blamed resulted in part from the deterioration of the political conditions that had made the old notions of virtue attractive and useful, and from the exacerbation of tensions that were already present in those notions. Briefly, moderation and daring are always perhaps in some tension with one another and with themselves. My sense is that the difficult material conditions brought on by the Peloponnesian War and stressed by Thucydides in his account of civil war, together with the shameful abuse of the law perpetrated by the partisans just prior to their descent into violence, helped undermine citizens' sense of the goodness and the beauty, such as it is, of moderation. The paper also discussed a suspicion we tend to have of moderation even in healthier times, namely that it can seem ignoble. And it considered the connection of this suspicion with Thucydides' presentation of the civil wars. That is, when Thucydides reports that during the civil wars, moderation came to be seen as a cloak of unmanliness, this critique is recognizable from ordinary experience. Often we do find that those who refrain from pursuing certain goods or satisfying certain desires do so because they are weak. More generally, we can say that in Thucydides' work and in life, we see that the noble can be understood as having at least two aspects, which typically have to go together in some measure for us to call something noble unqualifiedly, and which can both appear to be at odds with moderation. First, a display of strength or excellence that surpasses what men are commonly capable of, which we tend to admire and take pleasure in contemplating. And second, devotion to and sacrifice for a beautiful object. That moderation can appear to be in tension with both these aspects of nobility, even in relatively healthy political circumstances, and that Thucydides associates nobility, especially with the word daring throughout his work, might lead us to understand the aversion to moderation on display during the civil wars, primarily in terms of a concern for the noble. The very fact that certain qualities are honored by the partisans suggests a concern for noble virtue, as do other features of Thucydides' account of the Civil War, which indicate the similarity of what was honored then to what is honored under more normal circumstances. For example, the partisans admire wholehearted devotion to their cause and hold considerations of mere safety in contempt. Thus, while it is surely perverse to call noble that which involves the massacre of one's fellow citizens, we might ask whether Thucydides intends his account of the change in morals to suggest that a preference for more extreme forms of nobility over the utility and modest beauty offered by moderation is the most important element of Civil War psychology. Or relatedly, perhaps the culprit is eros and the excessive hopefulness that comes with it, a crucial theme in Thucydides' work as a whole, which is surely relevant during the Civil Wars also. Several thoughtful scholars of Thucydides have suggested interpretations along these various lines. However, while Thucydides suggests that the partisans in the Civil War are concerned with nobility to an extent, he also suggests that they have much less ability to think of themselves as consistently noble than do the exemplars of nobility in his work, and he primarily draws our attention to a different psychological phenomenon. We see this first through consideration of the most massive difference between Thucydides' portrayals of the partisans and those of the clearly noble men. Instead of a focus on a beautiful object to which devotion and sacrifice are directed and which arouses immense hopefulness, as we find in Thucydides' depictions of nobility, we have in the Civil War account primarily an angry emphasis on causing evil to opponents. It is, of course, possible for anger and the desire to harm to exist alongside hopes for the achievement of a beautiful and good aim that comes with an elevating sense of one's virtue. However, Thucydides' account suggests that such an aim was not a primary focus of the partisans. If we first consider beauty, we see that while descriptions of the noble Athenians, the outstanding examples of nobility in Thucydides' work, contain striking references to their, quote, contemplation or beholding of the beauty of Athenian empire, no such object is mentioned in the Civil War, and the word noble or beautiful does not appear there, with the exception of a reference to some nobly spoken words that fall on deaf ears. In addition, Thucydides mentions several times the partisans' awareness of something that would threaten a sense of beauty, namely their own injustice. As the work's portrayal, especially of the Athenians, makes clear, to the extent one has one's injustice in mind, it is very difficult to think oneself devoted to the beautiful or noble. While the noble and the just differ, and it is possible to be more concerned for one than the other, Thucydides nonetheless suggests they are not fully separable. As to the partisans, Thucydides refers several times to their partial but remarkable awareness of their injustice. Though he speaks of a change in their understanding of moral virtue, he also indicates that such change as occurred was by no means complete. To the extent that it was incomplete, attachment to the old understanding of virtue remained, with an attending sense of their own wickedness. Multiple references to the partisans' awareness of their ongoing lawbreaking and the centrality of injustice to their self-understanding indicates that their sense of their nobility is contradicted to a considerable extent and is therefore likely to be relatively weak and compromised. If we are right that concern for and belief in one's nobility is not the distinguishing feature of Civil War psychology, we would expect the partisans also to be less hopeful than are Thucydides' exemplars of nobility, since in the latter, a sense of nobility is characteristically attended by a tremendous hope to attain a condition of extraordinary goodness. For example, the outstanding statesman Pericles promises that through nobility, his fellow citizens will attain a condition of superlative goodness, in the light of which even their homes and lands will appear as mere ornaments, namely everlasting glory. Not only will they be remembered, but their names will ring out, quote, on every opportune occasion in speech and in deed, end quote, apparently from the mouths of everyone in the whole world forever. Quote, for of famous men the whole earth is the tomb, and their epigraph is not only shown on a gravestone in their own home, but in lands not their own, there lives an unwritten memory in the mind of each, end quote. As to the partisans, a less hopeful orientation is in fact what Thucydides suggests of them. Their greatest risks seem to be taken less with a view to some good than to weaken or destroy their enemies. It's true that slaughtering enemies in a fit of anger could be said to constitute a sort of good for the person doing it, as it both satisfies a passion and removes a potential or actual obstacle to the realization of one's wishes. However, Thucydides' portrayal suggests that their own good was not the partisans' primary concern. This makes sense if we consider our most basic experience of what the Civil War account does stress, that is, great anger. Anger and the desire for vengeance seem to arise when we are prevented from fulfilling a desire. In a state of anger, we turn our attention to destroying the obstacle to the fulfillment of the original desire. Often we then lose sight of the original desire and fail to consider the question of whether destroying the obstacle will best help us to fulfill it. That is, we tend to forget to consider our own good. Perhaps nothing illustrates this unthinking aspect of anger more than Thucydides' claim that during the civil wars, quote, to get revenge on someone was more valued than not to have suffered beforehand, end quote. For here we see clearly that avoiding harm to oneself was less attractive to the partisans than harming someone else. Furthermore, while we do hear of certain gains afforded by Civil War conditions, we hear also of violent attacks that occurred, quote, not out of greed, but rather from want of control over anger. In other words, Thucydides takes care to distinguish greed from what motivated certain passionate assaults, and thereby strongly associates anger, the most conspicuous trait of the partisans, with a lack of concern for one's own good. Indeed, this angry self-forgetting is the distinctive psychological phenomenon that Thucydides calls to our attention in his fundamental statement about what caused the evils of the Civil War. For he attributes these evils to, quote, the desire for rule on account of greed and the love of honor, and also from these things, the zeal of men once they are set on the love of victory or factious rivalry, end quote. In other words, greed, together with the love of honor, can produce both a desire to rule and, once men have become set on the love of victory or the destruction of obstacles to the fulfillment of their desires, a, quote, zeal whose ends aren't specified here. Thucydides indicates throughout the work that greed or the pursuit of advantage, the love of honor, and the desire for rule are always present in political life, and they are clearly important here as well. But what seems distinctive about the Civil War account is the addition of an extreme degree of zeal, which he is careful to separate to a considerable extent from the concern for goods to which we might be inclined to assimilate it. He thereby stresses a new focus that takes on something of a life of its own. This in turn helps us to understand another feature of the description of civil war, the aversion to thoughtfulness or intelligence that arises under these circumstances. For Thucydides speaks not only of daring, but of, quote, thoughtless daring. In addition, as we have noted, he says that, quote, to be intelligent in everything was to be inactive in all, and that, quote, rash quickness was agreed to be a man's part, and caution and deliberation a good sounding pretext for shirking, end quote. Since Thucydides indicates that we associate thoughtfulness or intelligence with attentiveness to procuring our own good, this aversion is sensible in light of the above discussion. It's true that the opposition between thoughtfulness and the daring so characteristic of the partisans is also apparent to a degree, even in healthy political times. If the contemptuous suspicion with which bold and vigorous men often regard academics isn't sufficient evidence of this tension, we find further evidence in Pericles' funeral oration. But even when Pericles speaks to the Athenians in a way that suggests disdainfulness of calculation or intelligence, he does not deprecate these things to anything like the extent that occurs during the Civil War, and following his most disdainful remarks, Pericles is nonetheless able to promise the greatest goods. Indeed, as we have already noted, the experience of nobility or beauty tends to bring with it a feeling of immense hopefulness, rather than the fear that we are going to be ruined by it. Relatedly, it does not bring about such strong hostility as we see in the partisans to intelligence, that is, to the faculty that reflects on our good. The noble hopefulness to which we refer is not characterized by the most rigorous thoughtfulness, perhaps, but it seems much more compatible with thinking about one's own good than is the thoughtlessness of the partisans. Here again, then, we see that during the Civil Wars, two elements of our moral understanding that previously existed uneasily with one another, thoughtfulness and daring, come apart. Further consideration of an additional difference between the circumstances and experience of noble daring and that of partisan daring may help explain why. Thucydides links the nastiness of the civil wars to the disruption of the easy satisfaction of daily needs. In addition, he says the partisans were, quote, hopeless of safety, and he generally suggests a pervasive sense of anxiety among them. This sense of fearful deprivation seems opposed to the capacity for very great feelings of strength and excellence, that is, feelings of being in a generally very good condition, not least good material condition, characteristic of Thucydides' portraits of nobility. The emphasis on pain and fear may also shed light on the increasing extravagance of anger as Thucydides' account unfolds. One gets the sense that the partisans' very awareness of the badness of their situation motivates them to plunge themselves further into what self-forgetting relief anger can provide. Remarks such as to get revenge on someone was more valued than not to have suffered beforehand suggests not only that men suffer and react to greater provocations during the civil wars than under normal circumstances, which they surely do, but also that they actively seek out further experiences of anger, experiences that do provide some sweetness or relief. Unfortunately, such relief as anger affords only comes with actions that make the Civil War situation even worse, and thus the need for relief even greater, at least until one side has been obliterated, as eventually occurs. Thus, the lack of reference to a beautiful object, the partisan sense that they are in an important respect wicked, the deprioritization of the good, the intense aversion to intelligence or thoughtfulness, and the inclination to forget an increasingly terrible condition are all at odds with Thucydides' picture of nobility. While the experience of beauty does involve an element of pleasant self-forgetting, and thus points to some awareness of something we would like to forget, that noble experience is, it seems to me, and on the whole, opposed to the primarily painful, insecure, and elementally passionate phenomenon Thucydides stresses in the civil wars. These considerations are consistent with the fact that Thucydides does not use the word eros or its derivatives in his account. He seems rather to reserve that term for situations where great beauty, or, quote, the greatest things, are thought to be present, as is very great hopefulness, sometimes even for immortality. Again, this is not to say we need think eros or a concern for nobility were altogether lacking in the partisans. Thucydides' portrayal of the passions is extremely complicated. It's only to suggest that he means to draw our attention here to a psychological phenomenon that is in important ways different from that of eros or a misguided concern for nobility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allison, for that very thoughtful paper about, among other things, thoughtlessness. If you have questions you want to pose to Allison, I want to remind you, you should put them in chat and I will relay them later after our discussant speaks. But now I'll turn things over to Peter McNamara for his paper on Hamilton and War and Peace. You're muted, Peter. We can see you, but we can't hear you now.
That's probably the best way to, can you hear me now? Okay, good.
Yes, we can hear now.
Thank you. Sorry, there's a bit of a background noise problem at the moment. It's one of our Zoom era kind of problems. Thank you for everyone who's here. Thank you to Chris for inviting me. It's a real honor, a true honor to be here. I'd second everything Allison said about Bob. I couldn't have said it any better, so I'm not going to sort of go over that ground again. I would say that, that when Chris asked me to be on the panel, I suggested two papers. The one I'm going to sort of talk about for a little bit in a moment on Hamilton, but a paper on La Mettrie's treatise, Man and Machine. And I sort of mentioned that for sort of, I mentioned that because Bob, the first course I took at BC, in fact, was with Bob, and it was on Bacon. It sort of got me interested in the whole question of modern science, and it's something that I've pursued down the years since then. Chris told me that the Hamilton paper would be a better fit on this panel, so I went with that. It sort of occurred to me afterwards, though, that we would have to rename the conference to accommodate La Mettrie. We'd have to rename the conference something like Dishonorable Ambition or Dishonorable Epicurean Ambition. So I'm glad Chris steered me in the direction of saying something about Hamilton. The bigger point here is that I've learned a lot from Bob about American political thought, about modern political thought, and I've continued to learn from him right down to the sort of, well, if you accept this last crazy year, the present day. The last extended interaction we had, Bob led a reading group on Plato's Hippias Major on the theme of ambition. So I'm looking forward to continuing to learn from Bob. And as I said, it's just a real honor to be here. So my paper is about Alexander Hamilton. And I was looking at it last night. It's still very early in the morning, just by the way, in Arizona. I realized that this is a sort of pre-Hamilton the musical paper. So the Hamilton is kind of not the hip guy you see in the musical, but a more sort of sober, realistic human being. The paper deals with Hamilton on the question of war and peace. And there's a long sort of tradition of having a great deal of skepticism about Hamilton when it came to both domestic and foreign politics. in his own lifetime, he was sort of compared to Caesar, to Bonaparte. In the 20th century, he was associated with Hobbes, with Machiavelli, especially in the area of foreign policy. My paper sort of argues that the truth is less kind of salacious than that, but maybe more interesting in a number of ways. And so I really have sort of two goals in the paper. One is to sort of figure out what Hamilton's real opinions were. And the second one, and this is more speculative, is to evaluate or start to evaluate the framework in which Hamilton thought about international relations, foreign policy. Now, apart, in contrast to the Machiavellian Hamilton or the Hobbesian Hamilton, my Hamilton is a natural rights thinker, and in the tradition of Locke, Blackstone, Montesquieu in his own particular way. But in the area of international relations, Hamilton really follows in the tradition of the law of nations thinkers, and especially Vattel. And in the paper, I try and show just how much Hamilton's thinking on international relations rested on the thoughts of Vattel, but before him, Grotius, Pufendorf, Bullimanqui, and so on. Now, the deeper question, which the paper gets to but doesn't really answer, is how sufficient or how true is that law of nations approach to international relations. In the 18th century, you had people like Adam Smith, Kant, basically suggesting that it was a fraud. It was just an elaborate rationalization of the nation's perceived self-interest. I tend to think that that is not true, but that's the question my paper leaves you with, I think. Now, in terms of how the paper unfolds, there's a discussion of Hamilton's own experience with war. Hamilton was a staff officer for Washington, but he saw war firsthand. He experienced it. He describes it as a satire on human nature. But his experience as a soldier was also part of who Hamilton was. He was always Colonel Hamilton, later General Hamilton. So it's an interesting biographical journey to work through Hamilton's experience with war. The next part of the paper looks at Hamilton's thinking on constitutionalism, on the necessary economic and foreign policy requirements of what it takes to be an independent nation, so that the United States could take its place in the world and take an honorable place in the world because the United States was a young nation. Hamilton, and I think he felt this, and I think Washington felt this as well, really was forced into a position of, if not doing dishonorable things, doing things instead that were just not honorable, acquiescing to the slights that Britain and France gave it in the 1790s, and of course later on as well. But Hamilton's solution to that, which I've spent a lot of time thinking about, which other people have written about well, Harvey Flormenhoft, Carl Walling, was to create what the historian John Brewer calls the fiscal military state. This was really a new creation in political science, and Hamilton really did set the United States on that path. Now, I could sort of go on at length about that, but I thought it would be more interesting to get to the second question that my paper raises, which is just how adequate is this law of nations thinking? And the real problem with it, and this is what I think Kant and Adam Smith had their finger on, was that it spells out lots of principles. Nations are independent. You shouldn't butt into the affairs of other nations. You should abide by certain standards when it comes to trade, to intercourse between nations, the treatment of ambassadors, all that sort of stuff. But there are exceptions. And that's where the real difficulty arises. The exceptions sort of start to pile up on each other. And the question is, does that eventually lead to the disintegration of the entire framework? So let me sort of read a little bit from my paper and discuss the comments will cover sort of two incidents or two problems the United States faced. One was during the Revolutionary War, and one was not solved until the Louisiana Purchase. So the first sort of incident that episode, so to speak, that I'll talk about was during the Revolutionary War. The war is almost over. Hamilton has actually left the service, but there was an incident where an American army officer who was being held by the British was released to local loyalists. And the local loyalists hanged him. Now, Washington sort of blew a gasket when this happened, and he ordered that there should be a retaliation. So what happened was that the United States' British prisoners had to draw straws, and a 19-year-old British officer drew the short straw. So he was scheduled to be hung. Hamilton got word of this, and he blew a gasket. There was a bit of a miscommunication between him and Washington on this front. But he wrote, and here I'll start to read. The retaliation had the support of senior officers, Congress, and the public. Hamilton wrote to Henry Knox, he was a general on Washington's staff, to ask him to dissuade Washington. Hamilton reasoned as followed: the proposed action was barbaric. and could not be justified by necessity. The British had wisely changed their practices for handling prisoners after the incident. Thus, the retaliation served no purpose. Moreover, and I quote here, "A sacrifice of this sort is entirely repugnant to the genius of the age we live in, and is without example in modern history, nor can it fail to be considered in Europe as wanton and unnecessary." Now, Hamilton realized that this argument about enlightened principles might not stand up in front of Congress, in front of Washington, in front of the American public. So Hamilton went on in providing advice. If retaliation was truly thought to be necessary, he advised that, quote, "underactors be employed, and let the authority by which it is done be wrapped in obscurity and doubt." This had been the practice of the enemy, in fact. Americans should be just as adept. Now, that's pretty sneaky, but I wouldn't say it was Machiavellian. Hamilton did not think this kind of retaliation was truly necessary at that stage of the war. Indeed, he doubted that it ever could be. But if it was so judged, Hamilton was anxious to protect the honor of the nation and its leading general. The execution of Andre, that's a long story that many of you probably heard, was required under the laws of war. The execution of an innocent man was both wrong and would reflect badly on the nation's character and on that of Washington. And Washington's reputation, for all the sort of tensions they had, was a high priority for Hamilton throughout his life. Now, the happy ending here is that Washington was more conflicted than Hamilton thought he was, and the French king basically, so Washington dithered. The French king eventually ransomed the young British officer. So let me sort of talk a bit about the second example of necessity that really sort of raises a question about the Law of Nations approach to things. And that has to do with New Orleans. Hamilton was of the opinion throughout the 1790s that the control of New Orleans, the control of the Mississippi, was a strategic necessity for the United States. Such a strategic necessity that it justified offensive war. That is to say, a preemptive attack, the seizing of New Orleans to secure the control of the Mississippi and all the territories that it traversed. Now, it's an easy sort of slope slippery slope from there to argue that really this was a justification for imperial expansion, both south and west of for the United States. It's the case that Hamilton flirted a little bit with the Venezuelan revolutionary Francisco de Miranda, but it was just a flirtation. More importantly, Hamilton's goal in securing New Orleans, he was a bit doubtful about the Louisiana Purchase, like many Federalists were, but he thought this securing of New Orleans was essential, not for imperial expansion, but for consolidating the United States as a truly independent nation. So that was his thinking, but it does raise important questions about whether the whole Law of Nations approach to international affairs works or is consistent. So two kinds of questions arise out of Hamilton's thinking on war and peace, and especially his reliance on the law of nations. Does the plea or excuse of necessity, as Kant suggested, make the entire edifice of the law of nations and the international system it would seem to support a kind of fraud? Hamilton did not think so. At its best, the law of nations provided a structure for a peaceful international order. When that order breaks down, it provides a guide to mitigating the effects of war and eventually to restoring peace. Moreover, the gap between, on the one hand, structured in 18th century warfare, along with the general tempering or moderation of war achieved by Christianity, which is a theme of the paper. The difference between that and what Hamilton called Roman and Gothic violence shouldn't be underestimated. This might be a modest goal, but perhaps Hamilton's experience of war himself thought it was not an insignificant goal. The fluid, turbulent, shifting world of nations and empires means that a permanent peace is not a realistic goal. There will inevitably be conflict and the need to make exceptions to the ordinary rules of international politics. But one powerful advantage of the law of nations is that, as Vattel wrote, it does not, and this connects with Allison's paper, it does not confound what is just and good in itself with what is only tolerated through necessity. So why don't I stop there and we can take questions.
Thank you, Peter. Everyone, since the show Hamilton thinks they understand Hamilton, and you've managed to expose something left out of that excellent show. So I want to turn now to Adam for his comments on the two papers, and I want to invite people. I already have a question on chat, and to invite people to have other questions that I can then relay to the speaker. So I'll turn things over to Adam now.
All right, thank you. So to start off, I just wanted to thank Allison and Peter for their fantastic papers and to say that it is a pleasure and an honor to be able to take part in this event celebrating Professor Faulkner. So Allison, my first question pertains to the place of nobility within Thucydides' Civil War psychology. And my question is this: would it be inaccurate to call the angry zeal that is displayed by the partisans a modification or perhaps a degradation of what would in ordinary political life be an attachment to the noble? Your paper compellingly elucidates the complex and often perplexing features of Thucydides' Civil War psychology. You suggest that the extreme preference for daring and the contempt for moderation characteristic of civil war is indeed made possible by the tensions that are already present in ordinary political life. The relatively low character of moderation when contrasted with noble daring. Moreover, the partisans' admiration of wholehearted devotion to a cause, together with their marked contempt for considerations of mere safety, might suggest that the change in morals affected by civil war is due primarily to an extreme preference for the noble over the useful. However, despite the resemblance of these psychological phenomena, you compellingly demonstrate that Thucydides' account stresses other features of the partisan psychology as being the primary culprits of the reckless moderation of civil wars, namely anger and the desire to inflict harm. As you note, eros and a concern for nobility need not be entirely lacking in the partisans. But the partisans' emphasis on causing evil to their opponents, their sense of their own wickedness and injustice, and their angry self-forgetting all suggest that the partisan zeal fueling the worst excesses of civil war differs fundamentally from the feeling of strength and devotion to a beautiful object that is characteristic of Thucydides' most noble characters. However, would it thereby be incorrect to consider frustrated Eros as the deepest cause of the partisans' angry immoderation? I wonder if precisely an individual who would be attached to the noble under ordinary circumstances would, because of the pressures, anxieties, and frustrations of civil war, be transformed into an angry and zealous partisan. In other words, I invite you to perhaps comment further on how the deepest source of the partisans' zealous anger differs from nobility. My second question pertains to the features of moral and political life that Thucydides indicates as being the most important barriers for avoiding the immoderate excesses of civil war before they start. As you note in your paper, the events in Corcyra leading up to the outbreak of civil war involve a marked depreciation of the law. The law is first transformed into an instrument of partisan vindictiveness by the Democrats and oligarchs. Then it is disregarded entirely when its infractions go unpunished. These events throw the law into disrepute and, as you suggest, foster the immoderate excess that is the hallmark of civil wars. Moderation, then, would appear to be the most important virtue in regards to preventing the outbreak of civil war. And it is the one virtue, it seems, that is in most disrepute during such times. And as you note, the exemplars of moderation in Thucydides are the Spartans. Archidamus's praise of Spartan education highlights the close kinship between moderation, reverence for the law, simplicity, and trust. As such, does the facility of the Spartan regime in avoiding the evils of civil war suggest its superiority to democratic Athens? And to what extent does Thucydides think that the simplicity and moderation characteristic of Sparta can be reconciled with the nobility and daring that is so characteristic of Athens? Finally, I was wondering whether you might comment on the relation of Thucydides' civil war psychology to his claim that his work constitutes a possession for all time. If Thucydides' great theme is war, and civil war is nothing but the most extreme and comprehensive manifestation of war, then it would seem that Thucydides' account of this subject would be of some significance to the understanding of political life that his work seeks to offer. At the very least, the events in Corcyra would seem to demonstrate the fragility of political life and the malignancy of human nature when unbridled from its ordinary restraints. Thucydides, moreover, makes the somber judgment that such violence is bound to occur again in the future so long as the nature of human beings remains the same. As such, to repeat, I was wondering whether you might perhaps comment on how the account of civil war relates to the wisdom that Thucydides seeks to offer his readers. Peter, my first question for you is perhaps somewhat incidental to the main topic of your paper, but I was wondering if you could perhaps comment further on Hamilton's own experiences with war and ambition, and how these experiences informed his understanding of the rights of war and peace. In your paper, you stress that Hamilton did not think of war as man's highest calling, nor did he think of war as the end or goal of the political order. Nevertheless, war played a central role in Hamilton's own life, a role that seemed fueled not least by Hamilton's great ambition. The military provided him with an opportunity for upward mobility, and his exploits during the Revolutionary War brought him prominence and renown. In addition, Hamilton's frustrations with Congress during the war would seem to suggest that his ambition might have been channeled in much less constructive directions, if not for certain circumstances, such as the moderating influence of Washington. As such, I was wondering if you might perhaps comment on how Hamilton's experience of war relates to his understanding of ambition on the one hand, and on the other hand, how this experience informed his thinking about war and peace. Second, You stress that Hamilton's goals for the United States did not involve imperial expansion. Hamilton thought that the United States ought not to follow the models of the Roman or British empires. Rather, Hamilton aimed for the United States to secure its place within the international arena, guided by concerns of interest and justice. He thought that the United States could pursue a foreign policy that was both prudent and honorable, guided by enlightened principles within an international system regulated by the law of nations. That being said, to what extent did Hamilton think that imperial ambition might be a temptation facing the United States? If not in the near future, then perhaps in the distant future. Could you perhaps comment on how Hamilton might think that such a temptation towards imperial ambition could be mitigated? And finally, I have a question pertaining loosely to the influence of Thucydides on Hamilton and the American founding. Peter, in your paper, you note that Hamilton's political thought devotes attention to the problems of domestic insurrection and rebellion, in addition to that of foreign invasion. Hamilton, writing as Publius, states that there are seasons of insurrection or rebellion, such that even a well-constituted republic must be ready to confront these dangers. As such, Hamilton would seem to echo, at least partially, Thucydides' pessimism about this bleak feature of human nature. As such, Peter, I was wondering if you might comment on how Hamilton sought to mitigate this danger, how the new republic would be able to avoid the calamities into which previous republics fell. And to what extent does Hamilton share Hobbes's optimism that a perfected political science will be able to mitigate permanently those causes of civil war that Thucydides views as permanent?
Okay, thank you, Adam. So we'll have our paper givers respond to those challenging questions. So Allison, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you so much, Adam. What a helpful restatement of the argument of the paper, and wonderful questions, hard ones. Okay, so as to the first question, you tell me if I didn't catch you on any of these, if I have these wrong. So you were asking about angry zeal and its connection, its specific connection with nobility, and whether it could be understood as a modification or degradation of a kind of original attachment to nobility.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that's a hard one, but I'm inclined to say I don't go that way quite. Like, so I would say it's totally plausible to me that one of these angry partisans might have been noble before, but I think, well, one, Thucydides says something about a certain kind of noble person in the Civil War, although it's Gonios, so a kind of something related to maybe a nature, an inborn quality. I think somebody who knows Greek better can correct me. It's not kalos. He says those people, they get killed a lot. They and the smart people don't do so well because the nastier, stupid people get them, right? But let's see. So, and I guess also it seems to me that the person who's still deeply attached to nobility, it would be very hard for them to settle for the kind of nonsense that goes on in the Civil War, where you know, we hear things like they just they want to find new plots so they have new people to punish, right? And there's little suggestion in Thucydides' account, to my mind, that we're even being very particular about whether the people we're killing and punishing are people who have actually wronged us, right? That, like, what the plan is for all this. There's immense stupidity and just disregard for what's good. You know, there's an example where the two sides are fighting, and one of them the oligarchs worry that the Democrats are going to get hold of some weapons in an arsenal. So the oligarchs just set fire to everything in the vicinity of the arsenal, including their own homes. And Thucydides notes a lot of stuff was destroyed, and it's like if the wind had blown the other way, the whole city would have been utterly destroyed. And I just think this is things like this are a bit at odds. But maybe more fundamentally than that, I really get the sense from Thucydides that what's driving these partisans is fear and anxiety. And I think the attachment to nobility is quite different from that. Like I could imagine maybe now when, well, in our times, when perhaps our factions are a bit more ideological, if I could put it that way, and before, there might be more of this, something more like nobility and yeah, something zealous that's more related to nobility there. Whereas in Thucydides' account, he mentions, that the Democrats and the oligarchs both make use of fair sounding phrases. One says, I'm for equality for under the law, and the other says, I'm for moderate aristocracy. But he makes clear that I think that they really just want to beat each other, and especially as time goes on. So you can tell me what you think of that. The second question you asked about is Sparta superior? To what extent can we simply, or can we reconcile Sparta's sort of lawful simplicity with Athenian daring? That was it? Something like that. Okay, yeah. So the second question, and I don't think they go well together. I think my sense is you can either get a mixed bag of one kind or a mixed bag of the other kind. If you want the Athenian daring, you're going to get the Athenian vices, which include, for one thing, sort of a tendency towards nastiness internally. Not nastiness like civil war nastiness, but the way the Athenians treat Themistocles, for example, to whom they owed so much. They were happy to give him up for almost nothing. Whereas the Spartans treat their far inferior guy who actually was trying to sell Sparta out to Persia. They just do not want to accuse him of any wrongdoing. They want to just support him till the end. But is Sparta superior? I mean, I sure like them less, but it's nothing that they went, what is it, 700, however many hundreds and hundreds of years stable. They don't have a civil war problem. It may be that, I mean, Thucydides is so wonderful for bringing out, I think, that you can't have all the good things in one place. I guess maybe politically, ultimately, it's a better idea to go with Sparta, but you're going to miss an awful lot if you do. And then you asked about how the Civil War psychology relates to the wisdom that Thucydides thinks we can get from his work for all time, right? So I think I find it, okay, if he's right that these things are always going to happen and they're the result of a human nature, and a human nature that, I mean, he does give some suggestion that it's like not simply proven that our nature, he says if human nature remains the same, these things are always going to happen, which maybe doesn't state it too strongly, but we seem to be then, and I think there's evidence now, beings who are mixed up in certain ways and have certain kinds of longings that make us prone to this sort of thing. And that's useful to know, right? As you said, that the whole thing makes clearer in certain ways the delicacy of civilization. That's, if we could heed it, I think there's certain good practical advice there, that we're mostly not following right now, not making the law, obvious partisan football, for instance. And I mean that maybe this isn't, there's a certain attraction to revolution. See, maybe this is more typical among the young. I have to hear it from my students all the time. It makes me nuts. And Thucydides's picture of what, like, one could think, yeah, this is, especially now that I think we, we don't just have this sort of sense that there are rich and poor and there are always going to be rich and poor, but we have greater political hopes, right, for changing things permanently, improving things permanently. So the whole thing could look more noble, maybe in certain ways is more noble, but what he brings out about how something, even if it's not the whole story, it's part of the story and it's going to keep happening. This horrible frenzy, for instance, that men will that will take over men, and just the opportunity he shows for all kinds of degenerates to just sort of let loose during Civil War conditions, the fact that the smart and the decent suffer most, that's all, it should be sobering. So that's, maybe I'll leave it there for now. Tell me.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison, and also Adam. Peter, your responses, and then I have a few questions from the audience.
Oh, great. Excellent questions. Just on the subject of Hamilton and the military, or the military life, it is something I've sort of puzzled about. For Hamilton, the military was the path to upward mobility, which is, a very American story, I think. But as to Hamilton's ambitions, they were deep, profound. I wouldn't say dangerous, but sort of verging on dangerous. And I think your mention of Washington's moderating effect on Hamilton, I think that's very true. And of course, after Washington dies, Hamilton's career kind of spirals in a variety of ways. Sometimes I think this is exaggerated, but I do think it's true. And that part of the problem was him not seeing a role for himself and being sort of unwilling to just step out of the limelight or trying to be in the limelight. And one thing that's, I think, telling, and this was a point the other Bob, Sigliano, would make, was that Hamilton was always promising to write a great book, like a sequel to the Federalists, but he never did. And I think that's this kind of thing that could have, occupied his mind. But without that, it was politics that he saw the path to sort of continuing to be in the limelight, which you could say is a kind of character defect, maybe. On the second question of empire, Hamilton was, and I think this is a sort of understated theme in a lot of the scholarship, he was just from the get-go worried about how big the United States was, and how big some of the states were. And in some ways, he was not so much worried about the imperial ambitions of the United States, but of the individual states, like Virginia and so on. That was the real danger. Now, how would he have? Now that I mentioned this in the paper, that this might be short-sighted on his part. That for various reasons, the United States was destined to expand, And if it didn't expand, some other empire would. Spain, Great Britain, Russia, whatever. So in some ways, it's a kind of virtue on Hamilton's part that he sort of resisted this imperial expansion, but also maybe a kind of short-sightedness. And lastly, on the sort of Thucydidean pessimism question, it is striking that Hamilton, in various places, basically says, yeah, every now and again, there's going to be, a season of insurrection, which is quite a striking statement, and it implies that every so often there will be conflict within even a successful nation. Now, I think your question got to the point of whether political science can sort of contain this element of human nature, or whether it's continually going to sort of lead nations ultimately to self-destruction in one way or another. I think Hamilton is more optimistic than Thucydides. His embrace of the law of nations, I think, is one sort of part of that. So I would say that he's not a Thucydidean, although there are elements of Thucydides within Hamilton's thought. So I'll leave it at that. But they're very good, difficult questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and thanks to all three of you. We do have some questions from the audience, and for the sake of time, I will read the questions as they come in. The first one will be for Allison. The second is for both of you, and then another one for Allison if we have time. And I think appropriately enough, the first question comes from one of our present graduate students who's a former undergraduate student of Allison, so that we see Allison, the spiritual child of Bob Faulkner, and then her spiritual child, so a grandchild as well as also a child of Bob Faulkner at the same time, Aaron Gammonley. So Aaron's question is this. It begins with a fairly lengthy statement, but then does conclude with a question. I have a question about the tension between thoughtfulness and daring. If I understand your paper correctly, you've pointed to the fact that a tension between thoughtfulness and daring exists inherently in the concept of the noble. And civil war exacerbates this tension or brings it to light. I'm wondering about what exactly constitutes thoughtfulness. If we take thoughtfulness to be deliberation before action, with the aim of acting only after one has determined the right path to take, it seems to me that some level of thoughtlessness is required for all action, inasmuch as we can never achieve complete certainty about the right path, and must always resort to an approximation of what appears best to us, given our incomplete knowledge at the time. Of course, all action also requires some level of thoughtfulness, inasmuch as human beings must always act in accordance with their understanding of the world. So my question is, where do we draw the line and say that someone has deliberated enough to count as thoughtful? Do we know that someone has been thoughtful or thoughtless based on the consequences of their actions? And is this tension specific to the noble, or is it a feature of the larger tension between theory and practice?
Okay, thank you, Aaron, spiritual child. What a lot of good questions. Okay, well, so one thing I mentioned in the paper that I didn't get a chance to mention today is that the picture of intelligence in the civil wars is complicated. Like primarily it's deprecated. I think anybody who, like, let's not think, let's act, and anybody who thinks is a coward or nerd. But a couple lines later, Thucydides says, but there was this, they did admire the intelligence of it, sorry, people who were able to accomplish a successful plot against somebody else were admired for their intelligence, and even better, somebody who suspected a plot against somebody else. Those people were even more clever. And he also says that there was really impressive ingenuity and like sort of high level, in a certain way, intelligence at work in coming up with ever greater revenges and new and horrible ways to punish people. So we don't, I think you're totally right. We don't totally get rid of thoughtfulness or intelligence even there, right? Even in these people who in a certain respect hate it. And I think you're right that there's not complete thoughtfulness in most of us, right? Many good ones, but it does seem to me that there's a difference between, so Pericles, for instance, being able to say to the Athenians, we want to win this war, we want to have this empire, here are our resources, we calculate them out for you, here are our enemies' resources, here's why ours, and we'll prevail if we do X, Y, and Z, right? A kind of articulated goal and a reasonable, not perfect in Pericles' case, but still, while he was alive and in charge, a reasonable assessment of what Athens could do to achieve that goal, right? Whereas the partisans, I think it's not only are they thinking less, but they're distinctive in wanting to think less, particularly about their motive. So they can think quite a bit and well, apparently, about the means. How do I get that one and get him extra nastily? But they not only seem not to think, they seem not to want to think, is my impression, about anything bigger. If their end, the aim, right? Which makes sense to me because things are so terrible that the possible good aim is getting less and less possible. The goodness of an aim that's possible is becoming less and less. But tell me if I didn't, there might have been more to that. Tell me if I missed it.
Thank you. That seems right. And it seems certainly true that there's a difference between, you can look at certain actions in Thucydides and see that some people are doing more thinking than others. I'm wondering if you think, yeah, I guess maybe what the question behind my question is can we make full thoughtfulness a goal? And if so, I guess that would imply that nobility sort of holds us back from that in as much as it requires daring, which is at odds with thoughtfulness. But is that sort of tension resolvable at all, sort of as such, in something like philosophy?
Yeah, I bet it is, and I didn't mean to say that all daring or a situation where one would take a risk or do something dangerous and that would be stupid or anything like that. Guess I just meant to highlight that in the case of Thucydides' most noble people, the attachment to that tends to come with other hopes for what it's going to involve and bring along that seem somewhat less reasonable.
I see. Thank you. That does make more sense.
Thank you, Erin.
I think we have time for one other question, and this one is directed to both of you. It's from our former student, Tom Cleveland, who poses it in the first place for Allison and then asked Peter to join in. And it's in fact a sort of follow-up to Erin's question, I think. Tom says, I thought it might help to offer a concrete example of thoughtful daring. I thought it might help make sense of what makes daring thoughtless in many occasions. Does thoughtful daring require a noble object? Or could there be a thoughtful daring without it? And he also asks for Peter to give us a Hamiltonian concrete example of thoughtful daring, if there is such a thing.
Okay, so thoughtful. Well, the way that Pericles presents it, and I think he has some. No, I don't. I'm confident he has a sense of some difficulty here. So he says, for one thing, that the Athenians are the only people who can combine great thoughtfulness and great daring. He says for everybody else, they're daring out of not thinking. They're sort of stupid. They don't know how bad, how risky what they're doing could be. And he says, and the thinking people, they tend not to do much, right? They hesitate. He says, but the Athenians somehow managed to be both. And the way he puts that is to say, we think most about what we do before we do it. We deliberate, we're democratic. We do presumably the kinds of things Pericles is doing. That is carefully reckoning out what the city is capable of, right? And how it should do that. But on the, I want to say sort of on the private level, he also he maybe suggested a tension there, right? He seems to suggest to me, for thoughtful daring at the private level, you would need something like everlasting glory to make it to make the daring good. But he doesn't simply say that. That comes in after he has said, don't think about your advantage. Look at Athens and become lovers of her and offer her the noblest thing you can, namely your life. So it's not clear to me that he thinks, I think he thinks that's beautiful and excellent in many ways, but I think he worries about whether that's good, perhaps, hence the glory being brought in shortly afterward as a sort of, and this will come of it, so that you would need both to make it thoughtful daring, according to Pericles anyway.
Peter, you're going to get the last word aside from my housekeeping afterwards.
Sure, and I'll sort of extend this beyond Hamilton. Professor Lerner put together a book of his essays called The Thinking Revolutionary. And I think, Hamilton was part of that generation, that was daring thoughtfulness. And it's always good to sort of reflect on that as opposed to sort of daring unthoughtfulness or stupidity.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists and questioners. I want to thank Peter in particular for calling attention to Ralph Lerner, who is here, and to complete, in a way, the genealogy. Ralph was one of Bob Faulkner's teachers. So we have not only students and students of students, but teachers here, which is again, something that would be very hard to put together for someone else. I want to thank everyone for coming. Our time is really up. The next panel starts in half an hour and we'll start promptly. I want to thank the paper givers and Adam for setting a good example for the next panel, both in taking the right amount of time for their remarks and for making good remarks. And I look forward to the next panel. Hope to see some of you back for that, and as many of you as possible back for the roundtable tomorrow. So again, thanks very much for coming. See you in a while.
Thank you so much.
Yep,
Lovely
thank
to
you.
see you all.
Hello, David Lowenthal.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
It says I'm not qualified